Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing Benny Morris's 1948, the First Arab-Israeli War. I've actually done a review of this on my main Stephen Heiner channel. It was two parts. I think it went an hour and 15 minutes in total, much more in detail. That's not what I'm trying to do today, so forewarned, you're not going to get an hour and 15-minute review. I'm going to try to do something shorter and more focused, particularly on the expulsions. Now, this book is primarily one of military history, but it also covers what was happening 1947, 1948, 1949, all the way to the armistice. And I see it as a companion to his book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, which I also did a two-part review on, which is 2 hours in total. And I'll put links to all of those in the description, as well as cards if you'd like to see them, if you want to see a more detailed version of that. But these two books together, I find to be important because Benny Morris is an avowed Zionist. He's on the record as saying that there were ethnic cleansings, but the ethnic cleansing didn't go far enough because he sees it as creating this permanent problem. He says if we had just ethnically cleansed all of the Arabs, then we wouldn't have this problem today. There's a certain logic there. But you understand, obviously, this is part of why he may be reviled by people. And people might say, well, Stephen, why are you quoting Benny Morris? And I'm quoting Benny Morris, and why I refer to Benny Morris all the time is because his evidence, which you see very heavily footnoted, is taken from the IDF archives, which have been closed mysteriously after these books came out. His books, Ilan Pappé's books, Sima Flappen, all these people who were able to document using the IDF's own sources. And keep in mind, only 5% of the archives were opened. And just from that 5%, we were able to get all this documentation. And mysteriously, those archives are no longer available. What a surprise. But in just this text alone, 3 of the big lies that were always told: 6 Arab armies invaded us, we've only ever fought defensive wars, the Arabs told the Palestinians to leave. These 3 lies are specifically refuted in this book by Morris. And so if I'm going to argue with Zionists, I prefer to use Zionist authors to drop evidence on these people, if they're even open to hearing evidence, which isn't entirely clear. So, as I say, it's just going to be a shorter review today. Let's start with the conditions in 1947 prior. And if you're unfamiliar, there's the proposal for the partition state in which a minority of the population, the Jews, were to receive a majority of the land without any reference to the majority population, which was the premise behind the mandate system, is that there would be sovereignty. People would be allowed to determine what their country looked like. That was not allowed here. In fact, the minority was, as I said, given the majority of the land. The chief unanimous recommendations of UNSCOP's committee were the termination of the mandate at the earliest possible time and the granting of independence to Palestine. The majority, the representatives of Sweden, Holland, Canada, Uruguay, Guatemala, Peru, and Czechoslovakia, proposed partition, with an enclave under international control consisting of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The Jewish and Arab states were to be bound in economic union, were to function as one economic entity, and the British would continue to administer the country for 2 years, during which 150,000 Jews would be allowed into the Jewish designated areas in monthly quotas. During the first year of independence, the inhabitants of each state desiring to move to its neighbor would be free to do so. As it stood, the Jewish state, according to UNSCOP, was to have 500,000 Jews and 416,000 Arabs, together with some 90,000 Bedouins who were not counted as permanent residents. The Corpus Separatum of Jerusalem-Bethlehem was to have a population of 200,000, half Jewish and half Arab. The Arab state was to have some 700,000 Arabs and 8,000 Jews. That wasn't a typo. The proposed arrangement was described as the most realistic and practical possible. Now, we live in an era post-Dayton when we're thinking about how Bosnia is currently separated into Republika Srpska and the regular body of Bosnia-Herzegovina. That is an enforced peace that is working for the moment, but it's been a very short time. This was prior to that, where you had this idea of we're going to force people to live together. But even just look at that and listen to the conditions that I read and think, is that realistic? The so-called Jewish state was going to have almost as many Arabs as Jews, and we know not only from the demography of that time period, but today, Arabs always outpopulate Jews. That's just how it is. Arabs choose to have more children, Jews don't. Even even with all the work that the ultra-Orthodox do to carry their side. And very famously, I think David Ben-Gurion said that any Jewish woman who doesn't have at least 4 children is not patriotic, cannot be considered patriotic. But this was doomed from the very beginning. This is apart from asking yourself and looking into the legality and the morality of the British Mandated Palestine. Was it legal? I recently did a review on an article by John Quigley on this issue, which was published in the Journal of Palestine Studies. I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card. And as I mentioned, I've already got links to the videos that I've done on Benny Morris prior to that. But right away, you can see this is a problematic proposal. And even if you were to grant that the British mandate was legal and moral, you'd have to ask yourself, by what authority does the UN have to give away the land of another people to another people? So you're going to give the land of the majority population to a minority population. Under what legal or moral right does the UN propose to do that? So what happens prior to May the 15th, 1948? And if you don't know what happened on May the 15th, 1948, this is when Israel unilaterally declared independence and did so without a constitution and without fixed borders. And the strange thing, or perhaps not so strange, is to this day, and I'm recording this video at the end of 2024, there still are no fixed borders for Israel. Ask yourself why that is. Every other country in the UN has fixed borders, and they've announced these are the borders, here's the latitude, here's the longitude, etc., and they give references for what their borders are. Israel has never done that. Why? Because their ambitions are greater than what they were given in 1947, quote unquote given, and what they have today. As soon as Syria recently collapsed, the government of Assad, they went not only past what they've already occupied, the Golan Heights, they've taken more land. And they plan to continue to do that because Israel has no borders. Whenever someone says, does Israel have the right to exist? I always say, ask them. And in this case, I'm only copying what Francesca Albanese always asks, what is Israel? Can you please tell me what the borders of Israel are? And since Israel itself doesn't have borders, it's sort of a gotcha question, but got to give credit where credit's due. At a meeting of the 31st of March, the advisors acted to protect Arab property and deferred a decision about expelling Arabs or disallowing Arabs to cultivate their fields. But a week later, so this is early April of 1948, the advisors ruled that the intention policy was generally to evict the Arabs living in the brigade's area. The mainstream Zionist leaders from the first began to think of expanding the Jewish state beyond the 29 November partition resolution borders. As Chertok told one interlocutor, and this is Moshe Chertok, told one interlocutor already in September 1947, if the Arabs initiate war, we will get hold of as much of Palestine as we would think we can hold. He seemed to be referring particularly to the clusters of Jewish settlements left by UNSCOP outside the partition borders, such as that in Western Galilee, from which even before the 29th of November, there was growing pressure on the Yishuv leadership for inclusion in the Jewish state. Moreover, the Haganah's limited retaliatory policy itself contributed to the spread and escalation of the hostilities, in one or two cases igniting a fire where none had been before. So remember, the narrative is, oh, poor, defenseless Zionists, we were attacked, we wanted peace. It's not true. We had Jewish terrorism early on from these different Zionist groups. The Haganah shift of strategy was decided on incrementally during the first half of April. Each decision appeared to be, and in large measure was, a response to a particular local challenge. But by the end of the period, it was clear that a dramatic conceptual change had taken place, and that the Yishuv had gone over to the offensive and was now engaged in a war of conquest. That war of conquest was prefigured in Plan D. So Plan D refers to Plan Dalet. Dalet is the fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and yes, that does imply that there was a Plan A, a Plan B, a Plan C before you get to a Plan D. Plan Dalet was what to do in the case of British evacuation of the mandate, and how would they secure their borders, etc. And what was interesting was that the plan then morphed in practice, even though Morris is always going to tell us there wasn't a grand conspiracy, but in practice what ended up happening whether Morris wants to admit this or not, is that it was used as a form of expulsion. And just listen to his description of the plan and see what you would think. The plan called for the consolidation of Jewish control in and around the big Jewish and mixed towns, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, the sealing off of potential enemy routes into the country, the consolidation of a defense line along the borders, and the extension of Haganah protection to Jewish population centers outside the UN-sanctioned borders. In doing this, the plan called for the securing of the main interior roads, the siege of Arab towns and neighborhoods, and the conquest of forward enemy bases. To achieve these objectives, swaths of Arab villages, either hostile or potentially hostile, were to be conquered, and brigade commanders were given the option of, and these are quotes, destruction of villages, arson, demolition, and mining of the ruins, so if anyone were to come back to their village, they would be killed by a mine, or cleansing, again that's a quote, of militiamen and taking control of the villages and leaving a garrison in place. The commanders were given discretion whether to evict the inhabitants of villages and urban neighborhoods sitting on vital access roads. The individual brigades were instructed in detail about which British police stations and army camps they were to occupy, the particular roads they were to secure, and the specific villages and towns they were to conquer and either depopulate, destroy, and mine or garrison. In retrospect, Operation Nachshon marked the start of the implementation of Plan D. The operational order for Nachshon, issued by Avidan on the 4th of April, this is prior to May the 15th, 1948, when the so-called 6 Arab armies invaded. So these are offensive operations, not defensive operations. For the people who are just reading off the Zionist talking points, they don't even know their own history. The operational order for Nachshon, issued by Avidan on the 4th of April, defined the objectives as 1. To push a convoy from Kibbutz Hulda to Jerusalem, and 2. To open the road to Jerusalem by means of offensive operations against enemy bases. Read enemy bases, villages with unarmed civilians living in them, along the road to assure the passage of future convoys. The order's preamble noted that all of Shem's, that is, the Arab, villages along this route are to be regarded as enemy assembly points or bases of operation. So just blanket, all Arab villages are considered enemy bases. It doesn't matter that there's no weapons. It doesn't matter that it's women and children mostly. They're all, and this takes us to the present day, there are no civilians. They're all guilty, from a 2-month-old baby to an 80-year-old man. Most of these villages lay in the territory designated in the partition resolution for Palestinian Arab sovereignty, which meant that securing the road or corridor to Jerusalem would involve an expansion of the prospective Jewish state's territory, which means from the beginning this was an invasion. So even if they're trying to say, well, they didn't accept it, prior to May the 15th, 1948, when Israel declared independence unilaterally, they are invading into what the UN declared was Palestinian territory. From the beginning, they didn't care. They never cared. And so don't allow them to sell you the narrative that it was just poor defenseless them, and they wanted peace. They didn't want peace. They never wanted peace from the beginning. As the town's HIS commander, HIS is Haganah Intelligence Services, Yitzhak Levy reported on the 12th of April, the conquest of the village was carried out with great cruelty. Whole families, women, old people, children were killed. Some of the prisoners moved to places of detention, including women and children, were murdered viciously by their captors. This is a Haganah Intelligence Services commander who is saying this isn't, Hamas or some propagandist arm. And if you're noticing the date, the 12th of April, this is Deir Yassin that he's referring to. The most important immediate effect of the media atrocity campaign, however, was to spark fear and further panic from Palestine's villages and towns. And the legend of Deir Yassin just continued to grow as it spread through towns and villages. The broadcasts may, in part, have been designed to reinforce Palestinian Arab steadfastness, yet their effect was quite the opposite. Hearing of what the Jews had done tended to sap morale and precipitate panic. Indeed, the IZL immediately trotted this out in justification of the original attack. Deir Yassin had promoted terror and dread among the Arabs in all the villages around. In El Maliha, Kalunia, and Bet Iksa, a panic flight began that facilitates the renewal of Jewish road communications between the capital and the rest of the country. In one blow, we changed the strategic situation of our capital, boasted the organization. Menachem Begin, the leader of the IZL, who denied that a massacre had taken place, was later to argue that the legend of Deir Yassin was worth half a dozen battalions to the forces of Israel. Panic overwhelmed the Arabs. And it's true. But, so, continue on here. The mass flight from the towns and villages of Palestine at the end of April triggered anxiety and opposition among the Arab leaders. Victor Kayat, the Haifa notable, who then toured the Arab capitals, was told by the prime ministers of Syria and Lebanon of their displeasure, and in the first week of May, apparently in coordination with the British, the Arab leaders launched a campaign to persuade the refugees to return. The emphasis was on young, able-bodied males. On the 5th of May, still is 10 days before, again, the 6 Arab armies invaded, and Arab leaders told people to leave. On the 5th of May, King Abdullah publicly, and this is King Abdullah of Jordan, publicly called on every man of strength and wisdom who has left the country, let him return to the dear spot. No one should remain outside the country except the rich and the old. He thanked those who had remained in Palestine in spite of the tyranny now prevailing. A few days before, he had specifically pressed Bedouin refugees from the Beit Shean Valley to return. On the 5th through the 7th of May, the ALA, this is the Arab Liberation Army, mostly on the Syrian border, in radio broadcasts from Ramallah and Damascus, forbade villagers from leaving, threatening that their homes would be demolished and their lands confiscated. Inhabitants who had fled were ordered to return. The broadcasts were monitored by the Haganah. The Arab military leaders are trying to stem the flood of refugees and are taking stern and ruthless measures against them. So remember, whenever someone tells you that the Arab leaders told them to leave, ask them for the evidence. Benny Morris points out in the footnotes, I don't think of this book, but in the Birth of the Palestine Refugee Problem Revisited, there is no such evidence. If there were evidence, they would trumpet it around. It's the same idea of they've been offered a state 5 times, 6 times. Where is the evidence? Show us where Palestine was promised a state by the Israelis, as if the Israelis had the moral or legal authority to offer a state to the Palestinians. It's like a robber telling you, oh, you can have some of your house back. It's an absolutely strange and crazy idea, but we live in strange and crazy times. The occupation of these areas was followed by large-scale looting and vandalizing of Arab property by Jewish troops and neighbors. Walter Eitan, dragged by acting American Consul General William Burdett to look at a house in Bekaa, reported, every single room in the house has been smashed up. The whole place looked as if a band of savages had passed through it. It was not merely a question of ordinary theft, but of deliberate and senseless destruction. A portrait had been left hanging on the wall with the face neatly cut out with a knife. As we went from room to room, I felt more and more speechless and more ashamed. I could only express my great regret. My question is, where are those Jews today? Instead, what happens is the idea of post pictures, posing with children's toys, posting with women's lingerie, and they upload it to social media. We've gone from I'm ashamed, I could only express my great regret, to publishing my war crimes on social media. That has been the progress of Zionism and this hateful, genocidal, apartheid regime. After the war, the Israelis tended to hail the purity of arms of its militiamen and soldiers, and to contrast this with Arab barbarism, which on occasion expressed itself in the mutilation of captured Jewish corpses. This reinforced the Israelis' positive self-image and helped them sell the new state abroad. It also demonized the enemy. In truth, however, the Jews committed far more atrocities than the Arabs, and killed far more civilians and POWs in deliberate acts of brutality in the course of 1948. This was probably due to the circumstance that the victorious Israelis captured some 400 Arab villages and towns during April through November of 1948, whereas the Palestinian Arabs and ALA failed to take any settlements, and the Arab armies that invaded in mid-May overran fewer than a dozen Jewish settlements. So Morris says, yes, the Israelis were far more guilty of far more atrocities, rapes, and murders, but that's because, they took more villages. Not he's trying to give the mathematical, and that's not implausible, but it's one way to try to deflect from the realities. Who committed more rapes? Who committed more murders? Who killed more civilians? It's not even close in terms of numbers, and he footnotes that for us from the start. And so this is talking about the quote-unquote 6 Arab armies. And if you want more details, I probably run out of cards. I think you're only allowed to ever put 5 cards up in a YouTube video, so I'll just leave this in the description. But if you want to know more about the battle plan and how the quote-unquote 6 Arab armies coordinated with each other, you'll find out they didn't. And this is in Eugene Rogan and Avi Shlaim's book, The War for Palestine, which features a bunch of different essays by academics talking about the different armies. There was no coordinated attack. There was no coordinated plan. And you have to realize they were only fighting for an intellectual notion, these volunteers. They were not fighting for their own land. And so here's 2 bits of context. From the start, the invasion plans had failed to assign any task whatsoever to the Palestinian Arabs or to take account of their political aspirations. And we know that King Abdullah had made a secret treaty with the Israelis to occupy the West Bank. So he certainly didn't want an independent Palestinian state because he wanted to annex more land. Although the Arab leaders vaguely alluded to a duty to, quote, save the Palestinians, none of them seriously contemplated the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state with Husseini at its head. All the leaders loathed Husseini. All, to one degree or another, cared little about Palestinian goals, their rhetoric notwithstanding. It was with this in mind that Jordan, on the eve of the invasion, ordered the ALA out of the West Bank and subsequently disarmed the local Arab militias. And that attitude continues to this day. That's why you'll hear a lot of talk from the Arab nations, but none of them are willing to put their lives and their economic livelihood on the line for the Palestinians. Whether that's right or wrong is not as important as realizing that that's the truth of the situation. So they can talk a good game, they can say we stand in solidarity with Palestine, but they're not willing to do anything for Palestine. Up until right now, this very moment where we're seeing the genocide televised all around the world, they're still not willing to do anything. The soldiers of the Arab armies were less motivated. Though keen on defeating the Jews, seen as religious infidels and political usurpers, and helping their Palestinian brothers, they did not view the war as an existential proposition. Their states, villages and towns and families were not under real threat. In defeat, they could still return to hearth and home. The Arab soldiers were invaders fighting a long way from home for a remote and somewhat abstract cause. This gap in motivation was to tell on the battlefield, especially in May and June, when small Jewish units with rifles and Molotov cocktails staved off far larger Arab forces backed by armor and artillery, as in Kibbutz Nirim and Kibbutz Degania Aleph. And not even in these pitched battles, but even in the city of Jerusalem, there were 14, 15, 16-year-old Jewish kids who were holding off trained soldiers. It was an entirely different level of motivation between the two. Even though the Arabs had superior weapons and numbers, you could say, before that first truce. So that first truce happens. What happens during that time? Well, the IDF addressed that number difference right away. And keep in mind, even at the beginning, the Arabs may have had more weapons and more artillery, more planes, but that they didn't have more numbers. And then that number disparity was made even greater after the first truce. The IDF's manpower almost doubled between the 15th of May and the 9th of July, the number in uniform rising from some 30 to 35,000 to 65,000. So I think more than a 2 or a 3 to 1 difference. So again, oh no, we were invaded by 6 Arab armies sounds kind of silly when you say, but we outnumbered them by 3 to 1. So what's the fear about the 6 Arab armies, even though that there weren't actually 6 Arab armies invading? Perhaps as many as Perhaps as many as 4,000 of the new recruits were veterans of the Allied armies, British, American, Canadian, Czech, of World War II, who came from abroad to help out. The Israelis also managed to bring in large quantities of arms. By the end of the truce, more than 25,000 rifles, 5,000 machine guns, and more than 50 million bullets had reached the Haganah IDF from Czechoslovakia. During the invasion weeks and the truce, the Haganah IDF also began to receive some of the heavy weapons purchased earlier, principally in the United States and Western Europe. And he goes into more details about the type of weapons. I'll leave you to investigate that further if you're into the military history. You will be very satisfied with how Morris covers that aspect of this. So, what does the Nakba sound like? I'll read it to you and then I'll remind you. From Lydda, the inhabitants left on foot, some being stripped of money and jewelry by IDF troops at checkpoints on the way out. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because that's what happened during the Warsaw Ghetto expulsions. And you have Haganah veterans who are on the record, and I think most prominently in my memory this features in the film 1948 Creation Catastrophe. I'll put a link to that in the description, as well as a link to a live stream which I was able to do with one of the creators of that film. Really great opportunity. And in that film you have a veteran saying, I experienced this leaving the Warsaw Ghetto, and then we turned around and did this to the Palestinians. Who did the expulsions of the Warsaw Ghettos? From Ramla, the population was trucked to a point near the village of Al-Kabab, from which they proceeded eastward on foot. During the following days, suffering from hunger and thirst, dozens probably died on the way to Ramallah. An Israeli trooper later described the spoor of the refugee columns, to begin with jettisoning utensils and furniture, and in the end, bodies of men, women, and children scattered along the way. Old people sat beside their carts, begging for a drop of water, but there was none. Another soldier recorded vivid impressions of how children got lost and how a child fell into a well and presumably drowned, ignored as his fellow refugees fought over water. Nobody will ever know how many children died in the trek, wrote the Legion's commander John Glubb. An Israeli commander, notably Alon, later explained that clogging the roads with needy refugees served Israel's strategic purposes by cluttering the main axes against a possible Legion advance westward, by burdening the legionnaires with tens of thousands of people in dire need of succor, and by generally causing demoralization. Making such military use of refugees, i.e. human shields, remember, every accusation is a confession. Making such military use of refugees was later criticized by Mapam's co-leader Meir Yaari. For several days, IDF artillery and aircraft intermittently bombarded the villages, and on the 24th of July, Israel launched Mitzvah Shoter, Operation Policeman. The aim was to gain control of the coast roads. By the 26th of July, it was over. Most of the inhabitants fled before and during the attack. Hundreds of others were forcibly expelled during the following days. At least 100 militiamen and civilians were killed. The IDF blew up most of Ain Ghazal, Ain Hazal, and Jabba. Bernadotte, who was the UN mediator, subsequently declared the attack unjustified and demanded that the villagers be allowed back. Israel refused. What a surprise. During the truce, the Arabs and Bernadotte pressed Israel to agree to a return of all or some of the refugees, but the Zionist leaders had decided against this. By late summer 1948, a consensus had formed, and this was in the cabinet, had formed that the refugees were not to be allowed back during the war, and a majority, led by Ben-Gurion and Chertok, believed that it was best that they not return after the war either. The Israelis argued that a discussion of refugee repatriation must await the end of hostilities. In wartime, returnees would constitute a fifth column, but in private they added that, after the war too, if allowed back, returnees would constitute a demographic and political time bomb with the potential to destabilize the Jewish state, which to this day still only 20% of the population of Israel, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, still represent that, what many people consider an existential threat. So here's some of the cabinet discussions that led to that decision not to allow refugee return, which is still one of the most contentious parts of this conflict. The cabinet discussed the issue on the 16th of June. In speech after speech, with Ben-Gurion and Chertok setting the tone, the ministers spoke against refugee repatriation. I believe we must prevent their return at all costs, said Ben-Gurion, adding, I will be for them not returning also after the war. Chertok agreed. Had anyone arisen among us and said that one day we would expel all of them, that would have been madness. But if this happened in the course of the turbulence of war, a war that the Arab people declared against us, again, this is false even within the cabinet minutes because these expulsions happened prior to May the 15th, 1948, prior to any declaration of war. And because of Arab flight, then this is one of those revolutionary changes after which the clock of history cannot be turned back, except that has happened numerous times. In fact, prior to this, we have the population exchanges after the Treaty of Lausanne. The aggressive enemy brought this about, and the blood is on his head. The aggressive enemy. Like, who is the aggressive enemy here? Who is the aggressor? And all the lands and the houses are spoils of war. All this is just compensation for the Jewish blood spilled, for the destruction of Jewish property. Again, with the justification, every accusation is a confession. During the following weeks, Haganah and IDF units, as a matter of routine, destroyed, when they had sufficient explosives or caterpillars, captured villages, partially or wholly. Without doubt, an element of vengefulness and punishment underlay the destruction, to pay back villages for specific acts of aggression or the Arabs for the war they had unleashed upon the Yishuv. There were also economic considerations. The Jewish settlement institutions had always needed and wanted more land for existing and projected settlements. Destroying villages meant the non-return of the original inhabitants, which in turn meant that more land would become available for Jewish use. Above and beyond this, there were general and specific military considerations. And from summer 1948, immediate and long-term political calculations came to the fore. The villages had to be destroyed to prevent a return in order to obviate the rise of a fifth column, to keep down Arab numbers, and to maintain Arab-free areas the Jewish state intended to co-opt. We can't do it morally, we can't do it legally, so we will do it by any means necessary. And in fact, I think that would be a great subtitle for the Jewish state, Israel, by any means necessary. Same thing with the IDF, we're the most moral army in the world, by any means necessary. David Ben-Gurion well understood these contradictory perspectives, as he told his colleagues against the backdrop of the Arab revolt of 1936 to 1939. We must see the situation for what it is. On the security front, we are those attacked and who are on the defensive, but in the political field, we are the attackers, and the Arabs are those defending themselves. They are living in the country and own the land, the village. We live in the diaspora and want only to immigrate to Palestine and gain possession of the land from them. Years later, after the establishment of Israel, he expatiated on the Arab perspective in a conversation with the Zionist leader Nahum Goldman. I don't understand your optimism. Why should the Arabs make peace? If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. This is a quote of the founding father of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. And again, I don't expect Zionists who read talking points off a sheet who've never read any books about Israeli history to know this, but this is him saying, I'm going to repeat it. Why should the Arabs make peace? If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us, but what does that matter to them? Our God is not theirs. We come from Israel, it's true, but 2,000 years ago, and what is that to them? There has been anti-Semitism, but was that their fault? They only see one thing. We have come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that? To be sure, and this is the final note, while mentioning God, Ben-Gurion, a child of Eastern European social democracy and nationalism, who knew no Arabic, had failed fully to appreciate the depth of the Arabs' abhorrence of the Zionist Jewish presence in Palestine, an abhorrence anchored in centuries of Islamic Judeophobia with deep religious and historical roots. The Jewish rejection of the Prophet Muhammad is embedded in the Quran and is etched into the psyche of those brought up on its surahs. As the Muslim Brotherhood put it in 1948, Jews are the historic enemies of Muslims and carry the greatest hatred for the nation of Muhammad. So, again, we have Morris trying to give some context to give Ben-Gurion an out, but the reality, we have photographs. Prior to the mandate, Jews and Muslims lived in peace in Palestine. We have photographic evidence of Jews celebrating Muslim holidays and Muslims celebrating Jewish holidays. They lived with each other. There were not these outbreaks of violence until Zionists moved in. Jews did live in the land, but they lived in peace with their Muslim neighbors. So him trying to write backwards and say, yes, has there been Muslim aggression against Jews? 100%. Are Jews specifically singled out in the Quran? 100%. But that didn't dictate the realities prior to Zionists invading, disrupting, and eventually destroying Palestine. And there's obviously more I could get to, but I told you I wanted to keep the review short. I recommend that you read it. It's with the footnotes. It's over 500 pages, but it's one of those foundational books that I say you can't really understand the conflict if you don't understand 1948, and if you don't read Benny Morris, you don't have Zionist facts at your disposal to counter Zionists. If you enjoyed this review, consider hitting like, subscribe, share this with someone who's open-minded, the rare person who's open-minded on this issue, and encourage them to look and examine the facts. And remember, these aren't my words, these are Benny Morris's words, who are quoting often David Ben-Gurion, IDF intelligence officers, generals, etc. Consider supporting the work through links to the description for PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. You can also look at my Amazon wish list to buy books to nominate for me to review in 2025. And a reminder that proceeds from any of these different possibilities and any of these contributions you might make go towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which helps Palestinian children get medical care that they could not otherwise get. Until next time, enjoy your reading.